All right. Good afternoon, insiders. This is Justin Rivers, Chief Experience Officer of Untapped New York. It is my pleasure this morning, actually this afternoon, just turned over, to introduce Meredith Horsford, who is the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. And Meredith, I hope I said your last name right. I apologize if I didn't. Please feel free to correct me. Also, like we have normally been starting, for those of you who are new to Untapped New York, welcome. And for those of you who are not, as you know, we've been enjoying starting these virtual talks and tours with a roll call from where everybody is from. You've already started. I see we have Florida, New York, Boise, Idaho. We have Washington State. We have Boston, Glen Park. We've got a bunch of San Francisco today representing in the house. Welcome, guys. Minneapolis. England. Yay, we got some England today. Westchester County, good old Queens, Bill from Brooklyn Heights, Cooperstown, New York. Welcome, everybody. We are happy to have you. Keep letting us know where you're from. If you have questions during the talk for Meredith, please put them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, and we will be bringing those to her attention during the Q&A. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Meredith. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. So let's see here if I can get to my next, whoops. Okay, there we go. So, hi everyone, thanks for having me. As Justin mentioned, my name is Meredith Horsford, and I am the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, which is located at the corner of Broadway and 204th Street in Inwood in Upper Manhattan. I'm here today to talk to you today about our Dyckman Discovered initiative, which is our research project on finding out more about the history of the people that were enslaved on the Dyckman farm. We have a lot of information about the wealthy landowners in this historic site, the Dyckmans, but that's certainly not the full story. And so this project kind of seeks to uncover more of that story so we can tell a more inclusive and a more complete narrative at our site. My educational background is in cultural geography, which many people ask me, what is that? So it's kind of the study of people and their relationship to their place. And so for me, the social history is always the most kind of fascinating part of everything that we do, at least for me, at the farmhouse. And I've been the director there for a little over 5 years. So let's start off. I mean, we're a historic site, so let me start off, of course, by giving you some history. So heading back to the 1660s, the first ancestor of today's Dyckman Farmhouse arrived and settled in the neighborhood that we now call Harlem. His name was Jan Dyckman. And in partnership with a friend and neighbor and another person from the Netherlands, Jan Nagel, the two kind of took over the neighborhood that we today call Inwood and turned it into farmland for themselves and to sell off to other arriving European families. During the American Revolutionary period, Jan's grandson, William, who inherited the family land, fled upstate, that would be Peekskill, with his family as the British troops took over Upper Manhattan. When he returned at the end of the war, the original Dyckman family homestead, located a few blocks north of the current farmhouse that you see in this picture here, had been destroyed. So William rebuilt the family home in 1784, that's again this house, and continued to farm on 250 acres of land. William's son Jacobus moved into the home after William's death, a year after the home was built, and took over the family farm. The farm continued to be inherited by Dyckman family members until about the 1860s. And with the growing population of Manhattan, farming was becoming less desirable as urbanization crept toward Upper Manhattan. And one other thing I'll add about farming in this area is if you've ever been in Upper Manhattan, you know that it's really rocky and hilly. So it's really not the most desirable farmland, which I think is part of what enabled the Dyckmans to amass so much land. The family tried selling the farm, and in 1871, it officially left Dyckman ownership. It went through a few different owners. It was even a rooming house for a period of time. And then it wasn't until the early 1900s that urbanization and the arrival of the subway system severely threatened the survival of the farmhouse. Descendants of the last Dyckman owners of the farmhouse, sisters Mary Ellen Dyckman Dean and Fanny Frederica Dyckman Welch, bought back the home in 1915 to preserve it. The sisters donated the home to the city of New York in 1916 to be opened as a museum. The home had really been in poor condition in the past decades, so renovation and redesign brought it back to the way the farmhouse is presented today. The Dyckman Farmhouse Museum has now been a museum for over 100 years, as well as obtaining national and New York City landmark status in 1967. And over time, the farm went from 250 acres to today, we're on a little over a half of an acre, which by New York City standards is pretty big. Here are a few historic pictures of the farmhouse to kind of show you the changes as the city kind of grows up around the farmhouse. You can see in 1866, Kingsbridge Road, which is today's Broadway, was a dirt road that ran directly outside the front of the farmhouse. In 1915, Broadway was evened out and paved, causing the farmhouse to appear to sit high above the main street as it still does today. In 1924, telephone poles were put in along Broadway, and today, this is a 2018 photo, the farmhouse is surrounded by apartment buildings and located across the street from a gas station. So the surroundings of the farmhouse have changed quite a bit over time, and I think that that's a really fascinating piece of its history. The Dyckman Farmhouse has tens of thousands of items in its collection that are a combination of Dyckman family objects that would have originally been in the farmhouse, items from extended family members, and objects that the museum founders felt should be in the farmhouse. In addition, amateur archaeologist Reginald Pelham Bolton, who did excavations across northern Manhattan prior to the opening of the museum in 1916, donated many of his findings to the museum. Many of the objects date to the Revolutionary War, as well as artifacts from Native Americans and Inwood family farms. Along with Bashford Dean, one of the creators of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, and Mary Alice's husband, he created an exhibit known as the Reginald Pelham Bolton Collection of over 5,000 objects. Today, the farmhouse is located in the vibrant neighborhood of Inwood, a community that is considered, and I'm using air quotes here, the last affordable neighborhood in Manhattan. It is a largely Spanish-speaking community with a large percentage of the population having moved here from the Dominican Republic and some other Spanish-speaking countries. There are many multi-generational residences as well as many young families. We are also in an area with several large New York City parks. The Dyckman Farmhouse is the only museum in the neighborhood of Inwood. And we're also in a community that is largely underserved, but has many small cultural organizations, many of which are partners of ours on public programming. In the last 5 years, we have made a lot of positive changes, including making sure that all of our communications and whenever possible, our public programs are available in English and Spanish. We removed all of the room barriers that previously prevented visitors from entering the period rooms. And we upgraded our lighting to an LED lighting system that provides more visibility throughout the previously very dark spaces. And we've created interactive exhibits and programming. We've given a lot of thought to expanding our historic narrative to include the stories and voices that we did not have very much information about, specifically the history of the people that the Dyckmans enslaved. With a very small staff of 3, including myself, and a small organizational budget, we did not have the resources or the personnel to dedicate to furthering this scholarship. Our first major grant for the Dyckman Discovered Project came from the New York Community Trust. They really saw the vision for this project and supported it, as did our board of directors. The grant from the New York Community Trust allowed us to hire a part-time research assistant to start to uncover information about the people who worked on the Dyckman farm and the other farms nearby. With new information, we have been able to design new educational materials for the museum, create public programs, and engage local artists to produce site-specific installations that communicate the story of these underrepresented people. This project reinforces the importance of inclusive historical narratives in America's historical institutions of all sizes. And in this photo, you see a part of our most recent art installation done by local artist Peter Hoffmeister, which I will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. As we continue our research, we are making discoveries about the lives of the enslaved and free peoples who lived in the Dyckman Farmhouse, as well as on neighboring farms. While much research is still underway, we would like to share what we know with you about the lives that we're learning about. Hannah. This is a picture of our winter kitchen, which is the lower level. Family tradition tells of a free Black woman named Hannah who lived with the family and worked as a cook. Based on those stories, we believe that she lived in the farmhouse in 1820. According to census records, Hannah was born between 1784 and 1794, which would make her between the ages of 26 and 36 in 1820. A 1917 report states the following, quote, "The cook, Black Hannah, who had been born on the place as the daughter of a slave, who was partly of Indian blood. Tradition describes her with a right-colored headgear, face black as ebony, temper decidedly irregular, and a strong leaning toward a corncob pipe," end quote. The only enslaved person that we know of by full name in the Dyckman family history is Francis Cujo. And the lantern photo that you saw earlier of Peter Hoffmeister's spelled out Francis's name. Francis Cujo was manumitted in 1809 by Jacobus Dyckman. He lived and worked on the farm roughly a decade prior to Hannah, but their time at the farm may have overlapped. So we know that Francis Cujo had been manumitted, but we don't know why. We don't know if it was because the Dyckmans felt like that was the right thing to do, or if he was not able-bodied enough to work any longer. So these are the pieces of history that are really hard to dig into, but that we're trying to find more information about. The Dyckmans did not keep records of their enslaved, and therefore some of this information is nearly impossible to find. However, the person that we have the most visual description about is a man named Will through this runaway slave ad. These ads were known to be full of detail, including phenotypic appearance, clothing, languages spoken, and talents such as playing an instrument. This May 1765 runaway slave ad, placed by Jacob Dyckman of Kingsbridge for a $3 reward for Will, described as, quote, "a Negro fellow named Will, or Wiltshire, about 40 years old, 5 feet 8 inches, very crooked legs, had on when he went away a blue broadcloth coat very short, homespun trousers, a beaver hat half worn with a hole through the rim," end quote. Will was enslaved by Jacob Dyckman, the brother of William, who built today's farmhouse. He is also the father of Garrett and Stotts Dyckman. We also have records of the people that they enslaved. We have discovered copies of 2 news articles pertaining to Gilbert Horton, enslaved by Stotts Dyckman, who's a cousin. An August 1826 article stated he was found, imprisoned, and was to be sold. Soon after, this was countered by a September 1826 article stating that he was a free man who had served Stotts Dyckman and was manumitted after his father, Peter Horton, served Stotts for 1 year for Gilbert's freedom. We have an 1809 emancipation record for, quote, mulatto Harry, born 1777, who served Garrett Dyckman, and an 1808 estate inventory of a Dyckman household listing various items, including pigs, cows, horses, and, quote, 1 man called Blossom, end quote. H. Dorothea Romer's Jan Dyckman and Descendants text tells of the location of a burial ground behind the previous farmhouse homestead. Quote, "For years after Jacob's marriage, the 2 families lived in the Dyckman house together. The burial ground lay immediately behind the house, and in unhallowed ground behind were the graves of over 30 family slaves," end quote. Today, this is located at PS 98's faculty parking lot, which is roughly on 212th Street between Broadway and 10th Avenue. The graves were dug up and destroyed during the progress of urbanizing Upper Manhattan in the early 20th century. Local amateur archaeologist Reginald Pelham Bolton, who I spoke about earlier, said, quote, "The remains of these humble workers of the past reminds us of the time when in this neighborhood, the practice of slavery was customary. Perhaps no other relic of the past could more decidedly mark the difference between the past and the present than the bones of these poor, unwilling immigrants whose labors cleared the primeval forest, cultivated the unturned sods, and prepared the way for the civilization that followed," end quote. So this is the information that we have found thus far in our research, and the research will continue throughout the end of the year. So here's a little bit about what we're doing with this information right now. You saw another part of artist Peter Hoffmeister's work in the Francis Cujo lanterns. This is another part of his installation. So over the last year, through a grant from the New York Community Trust and a grant from the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, we collaborated with local artist Peter Hoffmeister, who brought a year-long site-specific art installation to the farmhouse that sheds light on the unmarked African burial ground in Upper Manhattan, which included Harlem, Hunts Point in the Bronx, and Inwood, which resides on the PS 98's faculty parking lot. We've been in talks with our elected officials to help commemorate the Inwood slave burial ground and honor the lives of the people that were in it. We worked with then New York State Senator Marisol Alcantara in 2018 on a press conference to call attention to the burial ground. We know that there are a lot of people who live in Inwood who probably didn't know anything about this burial ground. Since then, we've continued the Dyckman Discovered Research Project, yet little progress has been made on a community level as multiple city agencies have jurisdiction over the land where the burial ground is located or was located. But our goal is to continue to talk about it and continue to raise awareness about it because it's an important piece of history. We also held a community conversation program in October of last year with scholars to introduce this project to the community, to let them know what information we've found so far and to gain feedback from them about what information they find most interesting and what kinds of information they would like to see in the museum moving forward. It was a very successful program that inspired a lot of really great conversations. Our next steps, once our research is complete, is to start to think about how we can infuse what we know about enslavement in what was then a very rural part of New York State throughout the museum. So we're kind of thinking, how does this change how our period rooms work, how our period rooms look? For example, would we have a mattress on the floor in the kitchen for the person that fed the fire all night long to keep the house warm? How does that change our public programs and curriculum? What new conversations will we have with visitors, and what are the best ways to share this information in an engaging way? We will be discussing these questions and more with scholars and colleagues so that we can ultimately present a more complete history for our community and open up new dialogues. I encourage everyone to follow us on social media, which you can see all of our social media accounts here, and to check our Dyckman Discovered and our Dyckman at Home pages on our website to stay engaged with this project and with other projects that we're working on. Thanks so much for your time. I'd love to answer questions.
All right, let's see. Pete Tannen has a question. What is the significance of the blank New York State historic marker? Does it represent the formerly blank history of African-American slaves in places as the Dyckman House?
Yes, so that was another part of Peter Hoffmeister's art installation. He actually sourced those markers and painted them, and he purposely left them blank because he wanted to show that there are all sorts of parts of history that we commemorate with plaques and remember, but that this is sort of untold history that most people don't commemorate.
Got it. And besides the art exhibitions, can you describe a little bit of the other types of programming that normally happen at the Dyckman House?
When we're not all working at home, sure. Right. So the bulk of our programming actually takes place this time of year traditionally. I would say May through October, obviously the warmest months are busiest for us. We do back porch history lectures in the summer. Our board president gives those, which they're great. He's a local historian. We do two different kinds of camps for kids. We do a STEAM camp. So it's all focused on science and the architecture of the house and plants. And you can see this picture of the kids kind of digging in the soil in these top two photos. Those are our STEAM camp. We also do an early childhood math camp. We do, let's see, what else am I forgetting? We do music performances. We've had local theaters come and do performances. We had the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival come and give a performance on our lawn. And we also do an annual fall festival, which kind of incorporates the artists that we work with. They do workshops, and we do kind of fall themed things like a cider press and and bring in actually 500-600 people, which
Wow.
is scary these days.
Sounds lovely, apple cider. Gretchen asks, how will you integrate the lives of the slaves into a tour of the house?
That I don't 100% know the answer to yet. I think that one of the things that we really want to be mindful of is that this is just as much an important part of the history of the farmhouse as talking about the Dyckmans, who we know all this information about. So I think that even though people think it's a difficult topic to talk about, that it's really important and something that people of all ages can sort of wrap their mind around and understand. So I think it's something that we'll try to think about how we can infuse it throughout.
Mm-hmm. And Elliot has two questions that are aligned with what we're talking about. First, she asked if you can summarize the timeline when the Dyckmans had slaves, and then whether the Dyckmans were Southern sympathizers during the Civil War.
There were parts of the Dyckman family who were on the British side and parts who were on the American side. It was kind of a large-ish family. I'm sorry, what was the first part of that?
The timeline when Dyckman had slaves, and also you were referring to the Revolutionary War time period.
Yes.
Okay, I think she was asking about the Civil War, if you know anything.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't recall that I have any information about them during the Civil War.
I have some follow-up, not about the Dyckmans, but in general, New York City was very pro-South during the Civil War because of business interests, Cotton Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And if you guys are interested, there's an amazing book called City of Sedition that I read. It came out a few years ago. I'm going to put the link in the chat. But it kind of digs back into that surprising history that's left out of the kind of prevailing narrative about the North in the Civil War. So.
Yeah, and that's another I think part of this conversation. I think it's important for us to talk about this topic because I think a lot of people have the impression that, oh, it's, New York is the North, and that somehow people think that in New York there weren't slaves.
Right.
But I mean, we know that not to be the case. Or that, we also get feedback when we start to have these conversations around Peter's exhibit, for example. We get people who ask, well, but if it's in the North, wasn't that kind of didn't they treat their slaves better than in the South? And I don't know how you treat a slave better
right.
than another
I think
slave.
a lot of the treatment was similar, North or South. It reminds me of, we did a tour of a church on the Lower East Side last year, and they've retained their slave galleries. And
St. Augustine's.
Yes, exactly. And I was told on the initial visit there that the slave owners would bring their slaves from really all over New York. So they were like taking them on boats to get to Manhattan so that they could bring them there. So anyway, just a fascinating history. If anyone has a chance to eventually go visit, they sometimes do art exhibitions as well inside those galleries to highlight their role. Anyone else have questions? Oh, here we go. Before today, I had assumed that the Dyckman House just interpreted another 18th century home. It's so great that you're researching and presenting the history of the enslaved people of the house. Reminds me of current presentations of foundations of George Washington's President's House in Philadelphia. Oh, sorry. And then the timeline of Dyckman slave ownership, if you have the year.
Let me think about that. It definitely goes up until slavery ends in New York State, which I can't think of the specific date off the top of my head.
Right. It was, I can look that up too, but I remember.
I'm afraid if I start to look it up, my screen will go crazy.
1829 says Beth, and Stephanie 1827. So around there. I think it's sometimes later than people think,
Yes. Well, and I also think that, people think that there was a hard and fast date where all of a sudden it was like, okay, this is the end. Go live your life.
I'm just going to jump in here for a second, just because doing a research on some other tours and projects. So the state officially or started a soft ending of slavery in 1799. And then I think it wasn't until about the late 1720s, it might be Beth State, like 1827-ish, I think the last slave was freed at, I think, in 1827, if I remember correctly. So it was a long period of sort of abolishing slavery, from the late 1700s into 1820s.
Yeah, and then I mean through the Civil War and before, there was a lot of movement along the Underground Railroad in New York. So maybe a lot of you guys know the history of the Underground Railroad in New York City, but that's also another really fascinating piece of New York's history. And we have also been to the Lot House, and they've got a room there where they believe that the runaway slaves, were being held overnight just to get to their next destination. Inda asks, would you be willing to provide the recording of the session to share with colleagues? We will be putting, like we do with all the presentations, the videos online within a few days. And I will send the link to our virtual content page so that everyone can check and look at past events. Gretchen asks, were they speaking Dutch or English at the time when there were slaves in the house?
We know that when they first came to this country, they were speaking Dutch. But I think that over time, over just a few generations, I think that they switched to primarily speaking English.
Great. There are photos of Peter Hoffmeister's exhibit, asked Lisa, and I'm going to repaste that link of the article.
Yeah, check out our website.
Yeah, okay, so it's on the Dyckman website as well, and we have an article from our coverage of that exhibition.
Great.
Last year. Okay, then a lot of conversation in the chat about the ending and beginning of slavery, etc. Okay, great. Justin, any last questions or anyone else?
Meredith, I'm not sure if you had covered this. I had to step away for a second. What were they mainly farming at Dyckman?
They had orchards. So they had cherries, apples, pears. And then they also had a lot of things that they were just kind of growing for their own use, like, onions, potatoes, those kinds of things.
Okay. So
I
mainly
think we all wish now we were growing things for our own use.
I'd like to even be growing things there, but we can't right now.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, Meredith, thank you so much. I think everyone is commenting, which you can't see, but I'm going to send you the transcript, just that that they've learned a lot of really interesting things, and they thank you for presenting. For everyone else, later today we have another event in partnership with the Waterfront Alliance. It's their online symposium, which is temporarily replacing the annual waterfront conference they usually do. And the title is Rising to Resilience, the Climate's Changing, Shouldn't We? And there will be a lot of discussion about how do we respond to disasters, which include COVID-19. Tomorrow, we have a talk from the author of the new book, Silent Cities, New York, Hidden Histories of Cemeteries, and she'll be focusing on Woodlawn Cemetery and taking us through some of the really interesting mausoleums and stories that are connected to Woodlawn. And then on Thursday, we're going to have a virtual tour of Queens County Farm. So we have 2 farmhouse events this week. So yeah, hope you guys will join us very soon. And thank you again, Meredith. This was great.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.